The sound of tearing canvas echoed through the grand house, a ghostly reminder of a silent rebellion that began with a single shocking act. Hester Price vanished that night, but her defiance remained woven into the very fabric of the Beaumont estate. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story opens not in 1838, but decades later, as a fierce spring storm lashes against the decaying Beaumont Manor in Natchez. Inside, a lone caretaker, an old man hunched against the chill of memory, hears it again. It is a sound that has haunted him for years, a sharp, spectral ripping noise that seems to emanate from the grand, dust-choked drawing room. It is the ghost of an injustice that refuses to fade, the echo of an impossible act of defiance. This sound was the only thing left of Hester Price, the woman who vanished into the night after destroying a simple painting. But what could possibly drive a silent, enslaved woman to risk everything, to commit an act of such shocking violence against a piece of art? The answer was a secret that would haunt this house forever. Back in the year 1838, the Beaumont estate was a monument to oppressive opulence, a gilded cage built on the sweat and sorrow of the people it held in bondage. The grand white columns of the main house rose like bleached bones against the lush, suffocating green of the Mississippi landscape. Manicured gardens, bursting with azaleas and camellias, were tended with a precision that belied the brutal labor required to maintain them. The air itself was heavy, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of magnolias and the stifling, humid heat of a Natchez afternoon, a heat that seemed to press down on the soul. Within this suffocating beauty moved Hester Price, a woman in her late 20s whose stillness was a form of armor. She was not defined by her suffering, but by the quiet, burning intensity that smoldered deep within her. Her hands, deft and careful, moved with a practiced grace as she dusted the ornate furniture of the drawing room, but her eyes missed nothing. They were sharp, analytical instruments cataloging every detail, every nuance of the world that imprisoned her. She moved with a deliberate calm, a mask of perfect servitude that concealed a mind alive with unspoken observations and a heart simmering with carefully banked resentments. Her silence was not empty. It was full of thoughts she could never speak, a rich internal world that was hers and hers alone. The master of this world was Hester Beaumont, a man in his 40s who wore his arrogance like a finely tailored coat. He was the epitome of the planter class, a man whose cruelty was not the explosive rage of a brute, but something far more insidious, a casual, systemic callousness born of absolute power. He wielded his authority with the unthinking air of divine right, his every command an affirmation of his own superiority. His obsessions were simple: appearances, legacy, and above all, control. He believed himself to be the master of all he surveyed, a belief that was perfectly, chillingly captured in the centerpiece of the drawing room. The portrait. It dominated the room. A masterpiece of oil on canvas that was both a testament to the artist's skill and a shrine to Alistair's ego. It depicted him standing before a romanticized vision of his own cotton fields, his hand resting possessively on a globe. The artist had captured him with a smug, proprietary gaze, the look of a man who believed he owned the very horizon. For the servants, it was a symbol of their master's power. For Hester, it was a daily torment, a constant, silent assertion of her bondage. The painted eyes seemed to follow her as she worked, their smug gaze a perpetual reminder of her status as property. It was not just a painting. It was the embodiment of the system that held her captive, a silent, unblinking sentinel of her own dehumanization. Hester's life was a series of vignettes, small, sharp moments that chipped away at her soul. One sweltering afternoon, she served iced tea to Alistair and his guests on the veranda. The men, fanning themselves with palmetto leaves, laughed as Alistair boasted of a recent land acquisition. "A fine parcel," he declared, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "And the hands that come with it are strong and healthy. Good breeding stock." He spoke of the people who worked the land as if they were no different from the horses in his stable or the hounds in his kennel. Hester's expression remained placid, a mask of polite indifference, but her hands, hidden by the silver tray, gripped its edge until her knuckles turned bone white. The delicate clinking of the ice in the glasses was a counterpoint to the silent scream building in her chest. Later, while polishing the family silver in the relative quiet of the pantry, her mind drifted back. A memory sharp and painful as a fresh wound surfaced. She saw the face of a young boy named Luke, the son of her friend, his eyes wide with a terror he was too young to comprehend. She remembered the sight of the trader's wagon, a cage on wheels rattling down the long drive away from the estate. Alistair had sold him away from his mother, away from the only home he had ever known, to a trader heading west toward the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana. Hester could still hear Alistair's justification, delivered to the boy's weeping mother with not a flicker of emotion. "He was of an age to fetch a good price," he had said, as if discussing a piece of livestock. He had broken his promise, a promise made to the boy's mother that her family would be kept together. The memory was a hot coal in Hester's heart, fueling the rage that simmered just beneath her placid surface. Now preparations for the grand annual party were underway, and the house was a flurry of frantic activity. The event was Alistair's chance to display his wealth and status, and he demanded perfection. Hester was tasked with ensuring the drawing room, the heart of the celebration, was immaculate. This duty forced her into an extended, agonizing confrontation with the portrait. For hours on end, she worked under its smug, painted gaze. She dusted the heavy gilt frame, polished the floorboards until they reflected the image like a dark, distorted mirror, and arranged the furniture to best display the master's likeness. The painted eyes were a constant, oppressive presence, a silent reminder of her powerlessness, of the fact that her life, her body, and the lives of her children were subject to the whims of the man in the painting. The oppressive weight of the atmosphere was palpable. Hester's internal monologue, a silent torrent of resentment and despair, revealed her growing desperation. She felt trapped, not just by the physical boundaries of the plantation, but by the psychological dominance symbolized by that canvas. Her silence was not submission. It was a coiled spring, tightening with every passing moment, with every casual cruelty, with every glance from those cold, painted eyes. The night of the party arrived, and the Beaumont manor glittered with a feverish energy. The drawing room, now filled with the wealthy elite of Natchez, was a kaleidoscope of silk gowns, tailored coats, and flashing jewels. The air was thick and heavy, a cloying mixture of expensive perfume, rich cigar smoke, and the sound of condescending laughter that grated on Hester's nerves. She moved like a ghost through the glittering crowd, her face a carefully constructed mask of subservience. She refilled champagne flutes, offered silver trays of canapes, and remained invisible, her presence acknowledged only when a glass was empty or a plate was needed. A portly, red-faced guest named Mr. Dubois, a man whose wealth came from shipping, gestured expansively towards the portrait with his cigar. "A magnificent likeness, Beaumont," he boomed, his voice slick with false sincerity. "It captures your spirit, the spirit of a man who commands his world." Alistair, standing beside him, beamed with a pride that was almost obscene. He preened under the praise, his chest puffing out, his gaze sweeping over the room as if to confirm his absolute dominion. Later, Hester passed the same group of men as they laughed at a cruel joke Mr. Dubois made about the docility of his own slaves, comparing their intelligence to that of his hunting dogs. The laughter, sharp and brittle, echoed in the crowded room, each note a fresh insult, a fresh reminder of her own humanity being denied. That was it. That was the final catalyst. The laughter, the fawning praise for the portrait, the casual dehumanizing comments, it all coalesced in her mind into a single point of unbearable pressure. The coiled spring inside her snapped. A sudden, shocking clarity washed over her. She saw her chance. The guests, led by Alistair, began to move towards the dining room for the main course, their laughter and chatter receding down the long hallway. For a fleeting moment, the drawing room was empty, bathed in the soft, flickering glow of 100 candles. With a calm, calculated precision that belied the storm raging within her, Hester walked towards the portrait. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and wild, liberating exhilaration. Her eyes were fixed on the smug, painted face of Alistair Beaumont. On a nearby writing desk among the quills and inkwells lay a heavy silver letter opener, its pointed tip gleaming in the candlelight. She picked it up, its weight cool and solid in her trembling hand. There was a sharp, violent crack as she brought the handle down on the protective glass, shattering it into a spiderweb of glittering shards. Then, with a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline, a lifetime of suppressed rage channeled into a single, decisive act, she drove the blade of the letter opener into the canvas. She aimed for the face, for the smug, proprietary gaze, and ripped it clean down the middle. The sound of the tearing canvas was shockingly loud in the opulent silence, a violent guttural scream that tore through the fabric of the house itself. But Hester did not flee in a panic. Her act was not one of mindless destruction, but of deliberate, symbolic annihilation. She let the silver letter opener clatter to the polished floor. She took one last look at the desecrated portrait, at the two halves of Alistair Beaumont's face hanging askew, his painted arrogance finally, irrevocably broken. Then she turned, and with the same calm, measured steps she used to serve his wine, she walked out a side door and vanished into the welcoming darkness of the night. Just as the first startled guests, drawn by the noise, re-entered the room to find the master's pride and his world torn in two. For a long, stunned moment, the only sound in the drawing room was the faint, musical tinkling of glass shards falling from the ruined portrait onto the polished floor. The guests, frozen in the doorway, stared in slack-jawed disbelief at the desecrated canvas. The proud, arrogant face of Alistair Beaumont was now a grotesque parody, split in two, his painted eyes staring in opposite directions. Then a woman, Mrs. Dubois, let out a piercing shriek that shattered the silence, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. The scream acted as a signal, and the room erupted into a cacophony of gasps and horrified whispers. Alistair Beaumont stormed into the room, his face a thunderous mask of confusion that was rapidly curdling into pure, murderous rage. His eyes, wide and wild, took in the scene, the terrified faces of his guests, the glittering debris on the floor, and finally the gaping wound in his own likeness. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, the sound of an animal wounded in its pride. "Who did this?" he bellowed, his voice cracking with fury. The force of his question made the crystal pendants on the chandeliers tremble. His gaze, burning with a terrifying fire, swept past his wealthy friends and landed on the small cluster of house servants who had followed him into the room, their bodies rigid with fear. He jabbed a trembling finger toward the ruined painting. "Who?" he demanded again, his voice a low, dangerous growl. His eyes scanned their faces, searching for any flicker of guilt, any sign of defiance. Then a new, more specific thought pierced through his rage. His eyes narrowed. "Where is Hester?" he demanded, the name spat from his lips like a curse. "Where is she?" The head butler, an old man named Elias, whose face was a roadmap of weary resignation, took a half-step forward. His hands trembled at his sides. I do not know, Master Alistair," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. She was just here." The uncertainty in Elias's voice was all the fuel Alistair's fury needed. With a roar of pure, unthinking rage, he lunged forward and seized a small, ornate table laden with crystal glasses and a decanter of brandy. He lifted it, his muscles straining, and hurled it across the room. It crashed against the far wall with a sickening explosion of splintering wood and shattering glass. The party was over. It dissolved into a chaotic scramble as guests, their faces pale with a mixture of shock and fear of Alistair's unhinged wrath, hurried to gather their cloaks and flee into the night. They wanted no part of the madness that had just been unleashed. In the ensuing chaos, as Alistair stood panting in the center of the room, a fallen king amidst the ruins of his own party, the other enslaved people exchanged fleeting, terrified glances. They were caught in the crossfire, terrified of their master's rage, but deep within that terror, a new, secret feeling was dawning, a flicker of stunned, breathtaking awe at what Hester had done. While chaos reigned in the great house, Hester moved through the sprawling darkness of the Beaumont estate grounds. Her escape was not the blind, panicked flight of a cornered animal. It was the careful, deliberate execution of a plan that had been forming in the quiet, desperate corners of her mind for months. She had watched. She had listened. She had learned the rhythms of the plantation, the patterns of the patrols, the secret paths that wound through the dense woods. She did not run. She moved with a quiet, fluid purpose, her bare feet making almost no sound on the damp earth. She used her intimate knowledge of the land, a map etched into her memory through years of servitude, to her advantage. She avoided the wide, moonlit carriage paths, sticking instead to the deep, inky shadows cast by the ancient, moss-draped oak trees. She followed the meandering line of the creek bed, the cool water splashing against her ankles, washing away her tracks as she went. The night was her accomplice, its familiar sounds a comforting blanket. She carried a small, tightly wrapped bundle, a pathetic collection of worldly goods that represented her entire life. Inside was a piece of dry, hardtack bread, stolen from the pantry, and a small leather pouch filled with dried herbs. The herbs, a mixture of yarrow for wounds and willow bark for pain, had been a gift from an old root woman who lived on the edge of the property. A woman who saw the storm gathering in Hester's eyes long before it broke. Hester's escape was her own act of will, but she had not been entirely alone. As she reached the outer perimeter of the estate, she found the small wooden gate in the fence, the one that led out toward the swamps, unlatched. It was a gate that was always, without fail, bolted at sundown. And Caesar, the master's most vicious hound, a dog trained to bark at the slightest disturbance, remained silent in his pen as she slipped past. Perhaps Elias, the old butler who had seen too much and whose eyes held a deep, abiding sorrow, had found his own quiet way to rebel. Perhaps another sympathetic soul had created the small, crucial opening she needed. It was a silent conspiracy of shared resistance, a small crack in the edifice of Alistair Beaumont's power. The sounds of the night, the ceaseless chirping symphony of crickets and the deep, guttural croaking of bullfrogs from the nearby swamp, enveloped her. The feeling of the cool, thick mud sucking at her bare feet was a grounding sensation. The air, rich with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, was the scent of her flight. Fear was a living thing inside her, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was a distant secondary emotion. It was utterly overshadowed by the fierce burning fire of her newfound freedom, a fire that had been ignited by the glorious liberating sound of tearing canvas. In the days and weeks that followed, Alistair Beaumont's fury cooled into a cold, obsessive quest for vengeance. He launched a massive, brutal search, the likes of which the county had never seen. He posted a reward for Hester's capture, an unprecedented sum of $500, a fortune that set the entire region buzzing. Slave patrols, their ranks swelled by opportunistic farmers and cruel-hearted bounty hunters, fanned out across the countryside, their hounds baying and straining at their leashes. Alistair himself, his face a mask of cold, implacable fury, led several of the search parties. He rode his finest horse, his eyes scanning the swamps and forests with a predatory intensity. He was a man possessed, driven by a desperate need to reclaim his property and, more importantly, his pride. But they found nothing. Hester had vanished as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. The hounds would catch a scent near the edge of the great cypress swamp, a vast labyrinthine wilderness of black water and tangled roots, only to lose it again in the bewildering maze of waterways. The only trace they ever found was a single tantalizing clue, a small, torn piece of blue cotton cloth snagged on a thorny branch near the swamp's edge. It was from the dress she had been wearing, but it told them nothing. The trail went cold. Alistair, his frustration mounting with each passing day, returned to the plantation and unleashed his rage on those who remained. He interrogated his other slaves, his voice dripping with suspicion and menace. "She is one woman," he would roar, his face inches from theirs. "She cannot have simply vanished. Who helped her?" His accusations were met with blank, terrified stares and trembling, whispered denials. They knew nothing, or if they did, they would die before they told him. His failure became a public spectacle. His neighbors and peers, the same men who had once envied his wealth and power, now whispered about the incident behind his back. Their sympathy was thin, barely concealing a current of schadenfreude. A man who could not control his own household, who could let a single, unarmed woman defy him so completely and then vanish without a trace, was an object of ridicule. His authority was undermined, his reputation tarnished. And through it all, the torn portrait remained hanging in the drawing room. In a fit of prideful, stubborn rage, Alistair refused to have it taken down or repaired. He wanted it there, a raw, open wound in the heart of his home. It became a monument to his failure and his shame, a daily, infuriating reminder of the woman who had challenged his authority and, by some impossible magic, had won. As the weeks turned into months and the search for Hester slowly dwindled into a bitter memory for Alistair, a different kind of story began to take root in the fertile soil of the slave quarters. It started as whispers in the dark, hushed conversations around the cooking fires after a long day in the fields. The story of Hester's act was told and retold, each telling adding a new, fantastical layer to the legend. It was no longer just the story of a woman who tore a painting. It was the story of a spirit of defiance made manifest. "She flew out the window," one young field hand would say, his eyes wide with wonder. Old Elias said he saw her sprout wings of shadow and just disappear into the storm clouds. Another, an old woman who remembered Hester's quiet intensity, would nod sagely and add, "She didn't need wings. She called down a spirit from the swamp to hide her. The master's hounds couldn't catch a ghost." They spoke of the look on Alistair's face when he saw the ruined portrait, a look of pure, impotent fury that brought them a secret. Dangerous satisfaction. They talked about the sound of the tearing canvas, embellishing it until it was no longer a simple noise but a supernatural event. It was, they whispered, a thunderclap from God, a judgment delivered upon the house of Beaumont. In these secret tellings, Hester, the person, the quiet woman who polished silver and served tea, began to fade. In her place rose Hester, the symbol, a figure of mythic proportions. She became a hero, a powerful conjure woman who had struck a blow against the master in a way no one else had ever dared. Her story became a secret currency of hope, a whispered legend of resistance that was passed from one generation to the next. It was a reminder that even in the face of absolute power, defiance was possible. And the torn portrait hanging in its place of shame in the grand house was no longer just a ruined painting. It was a relic, a sacred object that marked the site of a miracle. It was the proof that a woman named Hester had been there, and that she had refused to be broken. A year passed. The seasons turned, and the raw wound of Hester's defiance scabbed over into a tense, unspoken scar on the Beaumont household. Spring arrived again in Natchez, not with gentle breezes and soft rains, but with a brooding, violent temper. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric humidity that made the simple act of breathing feel like a conscious effort. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling in from the Gulf with a slow, menacing purpose. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Hester Beaumont sat in his study, a ledger open before him, though he had not turned a page in over an hour. He was a changed man. The fiery, explosive rage had cooled into a brittle, anxious resentment. He had taken a new wife some months ago, a timid young woman from Virginia named Clara, whose primary virtues were her respectable family name and her palpable fear of him. She was everything Hester was not: quiet, pliable, and utterly lacking in any discernible inner fire. Hester had thought her meekness would be a balm to his wounded pride, a placid mirror that would reflect only his own authority. Instead, her constant nervousness grated on him, a perpetual reminder of the terror he now seemed to inspire in everyone. As the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the window panes, Clara entered the study, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. "Hester, the storm," she whispered, her eyes wide and darting towards the darkening sky. "It looks to be a terrible one." "It is merely weather, Clara," he snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. "Go to your room if it frightens you." She flinched as if struck and scurried away, leaving him alone with the rising wind and the rattling of the window frames. In the kitchens, the servants huddled together, their work slowing to a halt. They spoke in low murmurs, their eyes full of a shared, unspoken memory. Elias, the old butler, polished a silver tray that did not need polishing, his movements slow and methodical, his gaze distant. They all felt it, the anniversary of the incident, a day that hung heavy and ominous in the air. The storm was not just a storm, it was an omen. The sky broke open. A torrent of rain lashed against the house, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. A flash of lightning momentarily bleached the world white, and in that split second, the drawing room across the hall was illuminated. The torn portrait, still hanging in its place of shame, leaped out of the darkness, its jagged gash a mocking grin in the spectral light. A deafening crack of thunder followed immediately, shaking the house to its very foundations. Clara screamed from her upstairs room. Hester flinched, spilling a drop of ink on his ledger. He cursed, his heart hammering against his ribs with an unfamiliar fear. The storm was directly overhead now, a relentless, violent assault. And then came the other sound. It happened at the precise moment a bolt of lightning struck a massive oak tree on the lawn, splitting it with a sound like the cracking of a giant bone. But this new sound was not the storm, it was not the thunder, nor the wind, nor the splintering tree. It came from within the house. It came from the drawing room. It was a sharp, distinct, and utterly unmistakable sound, a noise that sliced through the roar of the storm with chilling clarity. It was the sound of thick, heavy canvas being violently torn in two. Clara screamed again, a long, piercing wail of pure terror. In his study, Hester froze, the quill dropping from his nerveless fingers to stain the page with a black tear. In the hallway, Elias, who had been on his way to comfort the new mistress, dropped the silver tray he was carrying. It hit the floor with a deafening clatter that was somehow lost, swallowed by the echo of that other impossible noise. They all heard it. It was not a trick of the wind or a product of a frayed imagination. It was real. A new kind of fear, cold and supernatural, slithered into the house, and the very air seemed to grow still and heavy, holding its breath in the wake of the sound. For a moment, Alistair remained frozen, his face a pale, bloodless mask in the flickering candlelight. Then his own brand of angry denial surged back. This was his house. He would not be terrorized by shadows and sounds. Nonsense, he muttered, his voice a harsh croak. He grabbed a heavy, three-pronged candelabra from his desk, its flames dancing wildly, and stormed out of the study. It was a shutter. The wind must have caught a loose shutter. He marched toward the drawing room, a king going to battle against a ghost. Clara appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her face as white as her nightgown, her eyes wide with horror. Elias and two young housemaids huddled in the doorway of the dining hall, their faces a mixture of terror and a strange, grim validation. They trailed behind Alistair as he pushed open the drawing room doors, a small, frightened procession into the heart of the mystery. He held the candelabra high, its light casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Everything was still. Dust motes danced in the wavering candlelight. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight. The French doors leading to the veranda were barred, as they always were during a storm. Nothing was out of place. His eyes flew to the portrait. He held the light up to the canvas, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. It was exactly as it had been for a year. The tear was unchanged, a dark, jagged line running through his painted face. The edges were frayed and dusty. There was no rational explanation. He reached out a hesitant hand and ran his fingers over the canvas, half expecting it to feel freshly torn, to still hold the vibration of its own destruction. It was cold, dry, and still. "It was the wind," Alistair said again, his voice louder this time, but it lacked all conviction. It was a desperate lie spoken into a silence that refused to believe it. Clara, who had crept into the room behind him, was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "No," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "It was not the wind, Alistair. It sounded like it was in the room. Right here." She took a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on the ruined painting. "It sounded just like they said it did that night. The night she left." Alistair turned on her, his eyes blazing. "Do not speak of that." But the words were out, hanging in the air between them. Elias and the maids exchanged fearful, knowing glances. They knew what they had heard. It was not the wind. It was not a shutter. It was Hester. Her spirit, they believed, was now bound to the portrait, her act of defiance echoing through time, doomed to repeat itself with every spring storm. The legend the slaves had whispered in the darkness was no longer just a story. It had become a phenomenon witnessed by the master and his wife. The haunting of the Beaumont estate had officially begun. Miles away, deep in the tangled, watery heart of the great cypress swamp, a different world existed. Here, hidden from the eyes of planters and patrols, was a small, thriving community. A haven for those who had escaped the brutal reality of bondage. It was a village built on stilts and small islands of solid ground, connected by rickety boardwalks and silent canoe paths. This was a maroon community, a place of refuge and fierce, quiet independence. Inside a small but sturdy cabin, its walls chinked with mud and moss, a woman sat mending a fishing net by the light of a single tallow candle. The same storm that terrorized the Beaumont Manor raged here. But in the swamp, its fury felt different. It felt like a part of the natural world, wild and cleansing. The woman was thinner than she had been a year ago, her skin weathered by the sun and wind, but her eyes, fixed on the intricate work of her hands, were clear and calm. She now called herself Hester Freeman, a name she had chosen for herself, a declaration of her new reality. The thunder cracked overhead, and for a moment she paused. The sound transported her back, not with fear, but with a distant, detached memory. She remembered the feel of the silver letter opener in her hand, the glorious, shocking sound of the canvas ripping. the intoxicating rush of freedom as she slipped into the darkness. She felt no regret, only a grim, settled sense of satisfaction. She had taken a wound, and she had given one back. She wondered briefly what they were saying about her back at the plantation. She imagined Alistair's impotent fury, the whispers of the other slaves. She had no idea that her act had taken on a supernatural life of its own, that her memory was now a ghost that walked the halls of the great house. Her world had become small, focused, and intensely real. She was concerned with the present, with the daily acts of survival and community building. She was learning to read, her teacher an elderly man who had escaped from a plantation in Georgia decades ago. He was patiently guiding her through the pages of a tattered Bible, and with each new word she learned, she felt a piece of herself, a piece of her own mind that had been stolen from her, being reclaimed. Hester Freeman was no longer just a survivor, a runaway hiding in a swamp. She was a builder. She was helping to build a community, a life, a new identity, piece by painstaking piece. Her quiet, determined survival, her focus on a future she was making with her own hands, was a powerful, silent counterpoint to the psychological decay and superstitious fear that was beginning to consume the man who had once believed he owned her, body and soul. The ghost story being born back at the Beaumont Manor was his story, not hers. Hers was a story of life. The years that followed were a slow, grinding erosion of Alistair Beaumont's world. The supernatural sound became a dreadful, predictable ritual. Every spring, as the air grew heavy and the skies over Natchez turned a bruised purple, a palpable tension would descend upon the estate. The servants would grow quiet, their movements furtive, their eyes constantly darting towards the drawing room. Alistair would begin his vigil, drinking steadily from dawn until dusk, waiting. And every year the storm would break, and the sound would come, a sharp, spectral rip that echoed through the house, a sound that had become the estate's defining feature. The legend of the torn portrait manor spread through the county, first as a hushed rumor, then as accepted folklore. Business associates who once clamored for an invitation to the Beaumont's grand parties now found convenient excuses to conduct their affairs in town. A sudden illness, a prior engagement, a lame horse. The apologies were varied, but the message was singular. No one wanted to set foot in the cursed house. Alistair's social standing, once as solid and imposing as the white columns of his home, crumbled into dust. He was no longer seen as a powerful planter to be respected and feared, but as a pitiable, haunted figure, a man living under a curse brought upon him by his own arrogance. His wife, Clara, endured 2 more springs, 2 more terrifying nights of thunder and tearing canvas. She was a fragile creature to begin with, and the annual terror wore her down, hollowing out her eyes and leaving her in a state of perpetual, trembling anxiety. After the 3rd storm, she simply packed her trunks while Alistair was in a drunken stupor. She left a short, tear-blotted note on her pillow and was gone, returning to the safety of her family in Virginia, leaving Alistair utterly alone in the cavernous, echoing house. Her departure was not a dramatic event, but a quiet, pathetic surrender. Another piece of his life stripped away by the ghost of Hester Price. The supernatural had become mundane, an expected annual horror. This predictability, this cyclical dread of waiting for the inevitable, was a far more refined torture than any sudden shock. Alistair Beaumont was trapped, a prisoner in a cycle of his own making, forever waiting for the spring storms and the sound that heralded his damnation. With the passing of years, Alistair descended into a state of obsessive decay. He became a recluse, a ghost in his own home. His hair thinned and turned a brittle, lifeless gray, and his once handsome face grew puffy and florid with drink. The grand house decayed with him. Dust gathered in thick blankets on the ornate furniture, silver tarnished in its velvet-lined boxes, and weeds choked the once manicured gardens. Alistair spent most of his waking hours and many of his sleeping ones in the drawing room. The torn portrait was his sole companion, his tormentor, his confessor. He would sit for hours in a high-backed chair, a glass of brandy perpetually in his hand, staring at the ruined canvas. His mood swung wildly, unpredictably. Some days he would be filled with a belligerent, slurring rage. "Why won't you leave me be? Woman," he would spit at the painting, his voice thick with alcohol and self-pity. "I gave you a roof. I gave you food. I gave you everything." He would gesture around the decaying room as if it were still in its prime. "And you repay me with this eternal mockery, this endless tearing in my own home." Other times his anger would collapse into a pathetic, whining plea. He would stumble closer to the portrait, his hand outstretched as if to touch the canvas before letting it fall to his side. "What do you want?" he would whisper, his voice cracking. "Tell me what you want and I will give it to you. Gold? Freedom for them all? Just make it stop. For the love of God, just make the sound stop." His obsession was no longer truly about the woman who had vanished into the night. He rarely even thought of Hester as a person anymore. She had become an abstract concept, a symbol of his humiliation. His torment was about his own shattered pride. Hester, in her absolute absence, had become more powerful than she ever could have been in her presence. She had done more than tear a painting. She had torn the fabric of his reality. She had stripped him of his authority, his social standing, his wife, and finally, his sanity. He was haunted not by the spirit of a vengeful slave, but by the ghost of his own power, a specter that mocked him from the two halves of his own ruined face. The portrait was a mirror, and in it, he saw only his own pathetic, irreversible undoing. While the master of the house slowly unraveled, a new generation of servants grew up within its decaying walls. They were children who had been born into the legend, for whom the annual haunting was as much a part of the rhythm of the seasons as the blooming of the magnolias. Among them was a young woman named Sarah, who had just reached her late teens. She was the daughter of a housemaid who had known Hester, and she had grown up listening to the whispered stories. Unlike the older servants who still crossed themselves and fell silent with fear when the spring storms rolled in, Sarah was fascinated. The fear was there, but it was mingled with a deep, abiding curiosity. She secretly watched the master's long, slow decline. She saw the way he talked to the painting, the way his hands shook as he poured his morning brandy. She listened to the stories from Elias, the butler, who was now a stooped, white-haired old man, his body frail but his eyes still sharp. With the passage of time, and with Alistair lost in his alcoholic fog, Elias's fear had mellowed into a kind of weary reverence for what Hester had done. One quiet afternoon, as Sarah helped him polish a tarnished silver candelabra, he finally told her the whole truth. "He thinks it's her spirit, that she's a witch who cursed him," Elias said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. He paused, his eyes drifting towards the closed doors of the drawing room. "But the curse ain't in the painting, child. It's in his own memory." He told Sarah the story she had never heard, the story that the other servants only hinted at, the story Alistair himself had long since buried under layers of rage and denial. He told her about Luke, Hester's young son, and the promise Alistair had made to his mother to keep the family together. He described the day the trader's wagon came, and the cold, casual way Alistair had sold the boy for a profit. "He didn't just sell a boy that day," Elias concluded, his voice trembling with ancient anger. "He sold her hope. That painting, that was just the receipt." The knowledge settled deep inside Sarah. It changed everything. For her, the tearing sound was no longer a terrifying, supernatural event. It was a story. It was the sound of a mother's grief, a sound of righteous anger given a voice by the storm. It was a powerful annual reminder that even the most powerful master could be defied, that even the deepest injustice could leave a scar that would not heal. The torn portrait was not a curse. It was a testament. It was a symbol of hope, a monument to the enduring, unbreakable spirit of a woman who refused to be erased, a woman whose love for her child was so strong it had found a way to echo through the years and haunt the man who had wronged her. The final desperate act came during a spring storm of unprecedented violence. The wind shrieked and clawed at the house, and rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. Alistair, deeper in his cups than ever before, sat in his chair, listening to the symphony of his own private hell. The house groaned around him, and with every flash of lightning, the torn face in the portrait seemed to sneer at him. He was at the end of his rope, a cornered animal ready to chew off its own leg to escape the trap. He decided with the sudden absolute clarity of the deeply intoxicated that he must end it. He would burn the portrait. He would burn the curse out of his house. He staggered to his feet, knocking over his chair, and lunged at the wall. He struggled to pull the heavy, ornate frame from its hooks. It was heavier than he remembered, as if weighted down with the years of his misery. As his fingers strained and his muscles screamed in protest, the sound came. It ripped through the room, but this time it was different. It was not the familiar spectral echo of the past. It was louder, more violent, more personal, as if the canvas were tearing again right at that very moment, right under his hands. He cried out, a sound of both effort and terror, and with a final desperate heave, he tore the painting from the wall. It crashed to the floor, sending up a cloud of dust. He began to drag it, the heavy frame scraping and gouging the polished floorboards, towards the grand fireplace where a small, sullen fire struggled against the dampness of the room. He would burn it to ash. He would wipe its mocking gaze from the world forever. As he neared the hearth, a powerful, unnatural gust of wind burst through the French doors behind him, doors he knew he had barred shut himself hours ago. The wind howled through the room like a vengeful spirit, extinguishing the struggling flames in the fireplace in an instant and sending a vortex of hot ash and glowing embers swirling into the air. The room was plunged into near darkness, lit only by the strobing flashes of lightning from outside. And in the howling of the wind, for one heart-stopping moment, Alistair Beaumont heard it. Clear as a bell, a sound that was not the wind, a sound that was not the storm. It was the sound of a woman's laughter, low and rich and utterly triumphant. He screamed, a thin, high-pitched sound of pure abject terror, and dropped the painting. He scrambled backwards on his hands and knees, away from the cold fireplace, away from the doors, his eyes wide with a madness that was now complete. He was utterly, unshakably convinced that the object was cursed, that it was a vessel for a malevolent power, and that destroying it would not end his torment but unleash something far, far worse. Trembling, sobbing, he called for Elias. The old butler, drawn by the scream, found him huddled on the floor, a broken man covered in ash. Together, in the flickering, uncertain light of a single candelabra, the two men, one the master, one the servant, both prisoners of the same house, lifted the portrait. They hung it back on the wall. It was crooked, smeared with soot and ash, a pathetic, ruined monument to Alistair's complete and utter defeat. From that night on, he never touched it again. Alistair Beaumont was now and forever a prisoner in his own home, bound for the rest of his miserable days to the symbol of his humiliation, a silent, staring companion in his long, slow descent into nothingness. The year was 1880. And the world that had forged Alistair Beaumont had vanished. The Civil War was a memory etched in scars and stories, and the brief, hopeful light of Reconstruction had been all but extinguished. The South was a land of ghosts, and the Beaumont estate was its capital. Alistair Beaumont himself had died years ago, a bankrupt, broken man whose final years were spent in a state of alcoholic dementia. His only companion the ruined portrait on his drawing room wall. The estate, its fields fallow and its grandeur faded, had been sold for a pittance to a northern industrialist who saw it as a quaint, if morbid, investment. The new owners rarely visited, leaving the decaying manor and its infamous legend in the hands of a local caretaker who was more afraid of the stories than he was of trespassers. The paint peeled from the great white columns like sunburnt skin, and the gardens, once a testament to oppressive order, had exploded into a wild, tangled jungle. The legend of the torn portrait was no longer a source of immediate terror, but a piece of local folklore, a ghost story told to frighten children and entertain tourists, its true human origins buried under decades of superstition. Into this landscape of memory and decay came Jacob Stone. He was a young man from Philadelphia, filled with the kind of earnest, intellectual ambition that the Old South found both baffling and vaguely irritating. A historian and journalist by trade, he carried a satchel full of notebooks and a belief that the true history of the nation was not written in official ledgers, but was hidden in the oral histories of its people, especially those who had been denied a voice for so long. He had come to Natchez to document the stories of the formerly enslaved, to collect the folklore and songs that served as a secret-coded history of their lives. It was inevitable, then, that he would be drawn to the most famous and enduring legend in the region, the story of the haunted Beaumont Manor. Jacob began his investigation not at the foot of the decaying mansion, but in the dusty, quiet confines of the Natchez town archives. He spent days hunched over brittle, yellowed newspapers, his fingers tracing the headlines that chronicled Alistair Beaumont's slow, spectacular financial ruin. He read through dry town records, noting land sales and tax liens. From there, he moved to the local tavern, a place where history was served in liquid form. He bought rounds of whiskey for old men with long memories, listening patiently as they spun their tales. The white residents, their stories softened by time and nostalgia for a world lost, told him a ghost story. They spoke of a cursed house, a master driven mad by a vengeful spirit, a beautiful but wicked slave woman who had dabbled in dark magic and brought ruin upon the family. It was a Gothic romance full of shadows and superstition. But when Jacob sought out the elderly black residents in their small, neat houses on the edge of town or in the quiet, sun-drenched churchyards, he heard a different story. Their voices were hushed, their eyes still holding the shadow of a fear learned long ago, but their narrative was not about a ghost. They told a story of defiance. They spoke of a quiet, proud woman named Hester who had endured her master's cruelty in silence until she could endure it no more. They didn't know what had become of her, but they knew she had struck a blow for them all. The tearing of the portrait was not an act of witchcraft in their telling, it was an act of war. Armed with these two conflicting narratives, Jacob finally made his way to the estate itself. He secured permission from the absent owner's lawyer, a simple matter of a signed waiver and a warning about loose floorboards. He pushed open the great groaning front door and stepped into a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of dust, damp, and decay. Cobwebs hung from the chandeliers like spectral shrouds. In the grand drawing room he found it. The torn portrait still hung on the wall, a grotesque and compelling wound in the heart of the house. The light from the tall, grimy windows fell across the canvas, illuminating the two halves of Alistair Beaumont's face, his painted arrogance made pathetic by the jagged line that separated them. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. He was standing in the epicenter of the legend. He explored the rest of the ground floor, his footsteps echoing in the profound silence, until he found Alistair's study. It was a scene of utter dereliction. Books lay water damaged on the floor, and a fine layer of green mold covered the leather desktop. And there, in a drawer that had been pulled open and left to the mercy of the humid air, he discovered a set of leather-bound journals. For the next several nights, Jacob's rented rooms in Natchez were lit by a single oil lamp as he painstakingly pored over Alistair Beaumont's journals. The later entries were nearly indecipherable, the script a wild, paranoid scrawl filled with curses directed at Hester, at the storms, at God. They were the ravings of a madman, filled with obsessive, detailed accounts of every time the tearing sound was heard, each entry more desperate than the last. But in the earlier volumes, in the entries written before his madness had fully taken hold, Jacob found the first hard piece of the puzzle. It was a short, almost casual entry from the year 1837. In it, Alistair noted the sale of several assets to cover a gambling debt. The entry concluded with a line that made Jacob's heart beat faster, a mention of the unfortunate but necessary profit from the sale of a boy named Luke, Hester's get. The clinical, detached language was more chilling than any of the later rage-filled curses. The name was the key. The next day, Jacob returned to the town records, this time with a specific purpose. He searched for records of the Beaumont household, for servant rosters, for any mention of a woman named Sarah. The name had come up in one of the stories he'd heard from an old woman in the churchyard, a mention of a young maid who had been close to Hester. He found her. A Sarah Jackson was listed in the post-war census, her former status noted as a servant in the Beaumont household. With a growing sense of excitement, Jacob sought her out. He found her living in a small, neat cottage on the edge of town, a garden of collard greens and tomatoes growing in the front yard. Sarah was now an elderly woman, her back stooped with age, but her eyes, when she looked at him from her rocking chair on the porch, were as sharp and clear as a girl's. Jacob approached her with the deference and respect he had learned was essential. He did not ask about ghosts or hauntings. "Ma'am," he began, holding his hat in his hands, "my name is Jacob Stone. I'm trying to write the true story of Hester Price." Sarah's eyes narrowed. She was wary, her face closing like a fist. She had spent a lifetime learning to be careful around inquisitive white men. "Ain't no story to tell," she said, her voice raspy with age. "Just an old house with old memories." Jacob knew he had one chance. He took a deep breath. "I read your master's journals," he said softly. "He wrote about selling a boy named Luke." The change in her was instantaneous. The wariness in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else, a deep, ancient pain. She looked at Jacob for a long moment, studying his face, his earnest expression. She saw not the prurient curiosity of a ghost hunter, but the genuine interest of a historian. She gave a slow, weary nod and gestured with a gnarled hand to the empty chair beside her. "They tell it as a ghost story now," she said, her voice low and heavy with memory. "They talk about curses and spirits, but it wasn't a ghost that tore that painting, Mr. Stone. It was a mother." And then she told him. She told him the full story, not of a supernatural haunting, but of a human heart pushed beyond its limit. She spoke of Alistair's casual cruelty, of Hester's quiet, simmering grief, a grief that finally, irrevocably boiled over on the day he sold her son. She gave him the piece of the story that no one else could, the human truth at the center of the myth. As Jacob prepared to leave, his notebook filled with her testimony, Sarah gave him one last crucial piece of information. After she was gone, Sarah whispered, leaning forward conspiratorially. There were whispers, just whispers, mind you, passed along from folks on the river. They said a woman matching her description was seen heading north, following the river. Some said she made it all the way to Ohio. The information transformed Jacob's quest. He was no longer just a folklorist documenting a legend. He was a detective on the trail of a living person. The story was not over. Armed with Sarah's testimony and this new astonishing lead, he packed his bags. He took a train from Mississippi, the landscape slowly changing from the flat, humid delta to the rolling hills of Tennessee and Kentucky, and finally to Ohio. He began his search in the small, thriving communities that had been founded by freed and escaped slaves along the banks of the Ohio River. He asked his questions carefully, respectfully, in churches and general stores and barbershops. He asked after a woman named Hester Price, or any woman who had come up from Natchez, Mississippi, sometime around the year 1838. He followed several false leads, his hope rising and falling with each new rumor. Then, in a small, prosperous community not far from Cincinnati, an elder to whom he told the story listened patiently, nodding his head. When Jacob was finished, the old man pointed a long, bony finger down a tree-lined lane. "You might want to speak with Mother Hester," the elder said, a small smile playing on his lips. "She is the foundation of this place." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He walked down the lane and approached a modest but well-kept farmhouse. A vegetable garden flourished beside it and chickens pecked in the yard. On the wide shaded porch, an old woman sat in a rocking chair. Her hair was a crown of snowy white, and her hands, resting in her lap, were gnarled with age but still looked strong. She was surrounded by children, her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, their laughter filling the afternoon air. Her eyes, when they met his, were piercing and intelligent, holding a deep, settled calm that seemed as ancient as the river itself. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady and clear. Jacob's throat was dry. He could barely speak. He stood before her, a man who had chased a ghost across half a country and found a matriarch. "Are you," he asked, his voice trembling slightly, "are you Hester Price?" The old woman looked at him for a long, silent moment. Her expression was unreadable, her calm eyes searching his. The children fell silent, watching the strange man who had made their grandmother pause. Then, a slow, small smile touched her lips, a smile that held a universe of memory, of pain, and of peace. "I have not been called by that name in a very long time," she said, her voice soft but firm. "My name is Hester Freeman." She gestured to the empty rocking chair beside her. "Please, sit." The legend had become flesh and blood. The ghost story was over. History was about to be told. Jacob sat, the wood of the rocking chair warm against his back. The Ohio sun, a great molten orb, was sinking below the horizon, painting the clouds in strokes of fiery orange and deep violet. The air was filled with the scent of turned earth and blooming honeysuckle, and the sound of children's laughter slowly faded as they were called inside for supper. It was a scene of such profound, settled peace that it felt a world away from the decaying, ghost-haunted manor he had left behind in Natchez. Hester Freeman watched the last sliver of sun disappear, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Her voice, when she began to speak, was not filled with the fire of anger or the bitterness of old wounds. It was calm, measured, and as strong as the ancient river that flowed nearby, a river that had carried her to freedom. "Master Alistair, he believed he owned people," she began, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "But he was wrong. A master does not truly own your body, not in the way that matters. Your body can still feel the sun, your hands can still work, your feet can still walk. No, what he owns is the hope for your children. He owns their future. When he took my boy, when he sold my Luke away from me, he took everything that was not already in chains. He took the morning, he took the evening, he took the reason I drew breath." She paused, and in the quiet, Jacob could hear the distant chirping of crickets. "So I decided to take something from him. Not his life, I am not a killer. Not his gold, I had no use for it. I took the one thing he valued more than anything. His pride, captured in paint and oil on a piece of canvas. He looked at that painting and saw a god, I wanted him to look at it and see what I saw, a broken, empty man. She described her escape in detail, her voice a steady, even narrative. She confirmed Jacob's suspicion, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Old Elias," she said softly. "He was a good man trapped in a bad place. He never said a word to me, not a single one. But that night, the night of the party, as I passed him in the hall, he looked at me and I saw it in his eyes. He knew. He didn't know what I was going to do, but he knew my spirit was broken. The gate to the swamp path was always bolted. That night it was not. That was all I needed." She spoke of her journey north, a harrowing trek through darkness and fear, aided by a secret network of quiet heroes. She spoke of the kindness of strangers, Quakers who hid her in their attics, free black farmers who shared their meager food, people who risked everything for a woman they did not know. She spoke of the hardship and the back-breaking work, but also of the fierce, burning determination it took to build a new life from nothing. Jacob listened, his pen forgotten in his hand, his notebook lying closed on the porch beside him. He was no longer a historian recording a story, he was a witness receiving a testimony. Finally, he had to ask the question that had brought him here. "Mother Hester," he said, his voice full of a gentle reverence. "The legend, the sound in the house. Every year during the first spring storm, they say you can hear the canvas tearing all over again. Alistair heard it. His wife heard it. The whole county knows the story of the haunting." Hester turned her head and looked at him, truly looked at him, and a slow, deep amazement spread across her face. The lines around her eyes crinkled, and then she laughed. It was not a loud laugh, but a soft, dry, rustling sound like leaves skittering across dry ground. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated irony. "Well, I'll be," she mused, shaking her head slowly. "So my leaving made that much noise? I never knew. All these years I never knew." She looked out at the fields of her farm, at the sturdy house built with her own 2 hands. "I was too busy living to think about haunting anyone." She rocked gently in her chair, the soft creak the only sound in the twilight. "It's a fitting story, I suppose," she continued, a thoughtful look in her eyes. "He wanted that painting to make him immortal. He wanted people to look upon his face for 100 years and remember the great Alistair Beaumont. And in a way, I suppose it did. It immortalized his undoing. It became a monument not to his power, but to the moment his power was broken by a woman he thought was less than human. The mystery that had consumed Jacob for months, the supernatural puzzle that had defined the Beaumont legacy, was solved. It was not solved by a ghost hunter or a priest, but by a historian simply listening to a survivor. The haunting was not a spectral echo, but a powerful act of collective memory. The house was not haunted by Hester's spirit. It was haunted by Alistair's guilt, a guilt so profound it projected itself onto the world, but amplified by the terror and awe of a community that refused to forget her act of defiance. The sound was real because the memory was real. "You see, Mr. Stone," Hester said, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher, "an act of defiance is like a seed. You plant it in a moment of desperation, in the dark soil of your own pain, and you never know what will grow from it. I tore that canvas for myself. I did it to feel for one single, solitary second that I was more than just his property. I did not know it would become a story that would echo in the storms for 50 years. But I am glad it did." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. "It means that even when I was gone, something of me remained to trouble his peace. It means that story, our story, did not die with his lies." When it was time for Jacob to leave 2 days later, he felt a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer just a journalist chasing a story, he was a custodian of a truth that had been buried for half a century. He sat with Hester on the porch one last time, the morning sun warming their faces. He showed her his notebooks, the pages filled with her words, with Sarah's testimony, with the ravings from Alistair's journals. He promised her that he would not write a simple ghost story. He would not cater to the public's appetite for cheap thrills and gothic superstition. He would write the truth. He would tell the story of Hester Freeman, a mother, a survivor, and a builder, a woman who had reclaimed her own narrative from the man who had tried to steal it. "Your story is not about a ghost, Mother Hester," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about the enduring power of the human spirit. It's about a love that was stronger than chains. That is the story the world needs to hear." Hester looked at the young, earnest man before her. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, and she nodded, giving him her blessing. "Tell it then," she said. "Tell it all." A year later, the story was told. Jacob's article, titled "The Voice in the Storm, The True Story of Hester Price," was published in a prominent national magazine. It caused a sensation. It was reprinted in newspapers across the country. It took a piece of well-worn Southern folklore, a quaint and spooky tale, and held it up to the light, revealing the powerful, painful, and inspiring human narrative that lay at its heart. It reframed the legend, transforming it from a story about a haunting into a story about resistance. The narrative of Jacob's article became the final word on the legend, his voice narrating over the final indelible images of the saga. The Beaumont Manor, now completely abandoned, stood as a skeletal ruin against a darkening sky. A final spring storm, as fierce and violent as the one that had marked the first anniversary of Hester's flight, rolled in over Natchez. The wind howled through the broken window panes and rain lashed against the peeling columns. And inside the dark, decaying drawing room, for one last time, the sound was heard, a sharp, spectral rip, the ghost of tearing canvas, but this time it was different. It was not frightening. It was a final, fading echo. It was followed not by a terrified silence, but by a profound and lasting quiet, a sense of peace, as if a story that had been held in the house's memory for 50 years had finally been told, and a spirit, the spirit of a great injustice, could finally rest. Miles away, on a sun-drenched porch in Ohio, Hester Freeman sat in her rocking chair, surrounded by the vibrant living legacy of her freedom. Her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren filled the yard with life and laughter. In her lap, she held a copy of the magazine Jacob had sent her. One of her granddaughters, a bright young girl of 10, sat at her feet, carefully reading the article aloud. Hester was not looking at the article. Her eyes, clear and full of a deep, quiet wisdom, were looking out at her land, at her family, at the tangible proof of the life she had built. As her granddaughter read the words describing the sale of a little boy named Luke, a single quiet tear, a tear of pure, unadulterated catharsis, welled in Hester's eye and rolled slowly down her weathered cheek. Jacob's final words from the article hung in the air, a fitting epitaph and a lasting testament. The legend of the torn portrait has ended. The ghost has been laid to rest. But the story of Hester Freeman will live forever. It serves as a powerful reminder that history is not always written by the powerful, in the grand ledgers of commerce and conquest. Sometimes history is written in a single defiant act. Sometimes its voice is carried on the wind, a whisper in the storm, waiting patiently for someone to finally come and listen. The story ended there, not on the image of the ruined painting, but on the living, breathing portrait of Hester Freeman, a masterpiece of survival, strength, and everlasting peace.